0400 hours, Strait of Hormuz. 80 sea mines sit beneath the surface, and a tanker fleet waits at anchor for a payment that does not exist. 2 days earlier, in Qom, President Masoud Pezeshkian stands before Grand Ayatollah Shabiri Zanjani and tells him something specific. $6 billion, he says, is coming home from Qatari banks. A victory, he calls it, the kind hardliners can accept after 4 months of war. The room nods. The message travels fast through Tehran's political circles. But nobody in Doha has signed off on any transfer. June 30, 2026. A Qatari foreign ministry spokesperson named Majid al-Ansari stands at a podium and says the opposite. Qatar has not moved that multi-billion-dollar fund. Qatar has not moved $1. And that single briefing exposes a gap between what Tehran declared and what actually happened in the region's financial system. This is not a story about a broken promise. It is a story about who controls a choke point that carries a quarter of the world's seaborne oil, and what happens when the country that claims control turns out to have less strategic advantage than it thinks. Here is why that multi-billion-dollar balance matters beyond the headline. Iran's economy, after 4 months of the 2026 war, runs on fumes. The Islamabad Memorandum, signed by President Trump and President Pezeshkian on June 17th, establishes an immediate, permanent termination of military operations and buys a 60-day negotiating window to reach a final agreement. 5 days later, the U.S. Treasury issues General License X, a temporary waiver letting Iranian energy exports move through the banking system again. That waiver only works if money flows. Tehran needs cash, and it needs it now, because the 60-day clock is already running. The $6 billion in frozen Iranian funds sitting in Qatari banks looks, from Tehran's side, like the fastest solution available. Pezeshkian tells senior clerics in Qom that half of the funds are to be released. Therefore, the speech in Qom was never really about banking procedure. It was about buying political room at home, in a moment when admitting economic weakness could cost him the room entirely. If you're finding this analysis valuable, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into global security crises. So, how does an escrow account actually work, and why can't Qatar just wire the money? Think of it less like a bank vault and more like a lawyer holding funds in a dispute, funds that can only be spent on items named in the contract. The 2023 agreement that created this escrow restricts the $6 billion to one category: humanitarian purchases, food and medicine, verified line by line. Qatar is the custodian, not the owner, and custodians who violate a mandate expose their entire banking system to sanctions risk. Al-Ansari's phrase captures it precisely. Qatar does not own these funds, which meant Doha was never going to authorize that specific cash portion in unrestricted credit, no matter what Tehran declared to its own public. And that gap between a domestic political claim and an actual wire transfer becomes public at the worst possible time for Iran, because envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are in Doha the same week, and Qatar confirms there are no direct U.S.-Iran talks happening at all. The diplomatic track everyone assumed was quietly advancing turns out to be stalled right when Tehran needed to show progress. Meanwhile, 34 kilometers of open water tell a separate story about who actually controls the strait. Naval intelligence places anchored minefields, featuring mostly Iranian-made Maham 3 and Maham 7 models, across the primary transit lanes. These are not the crude contact devices of the last century. These advanced naval weapons use acoustic and magnetic triggers, tuned to detect the specific signature of a large hull, and they feature conical geometries designed to scatter sonar waves. A merchant tanker with a shallow draft can pass within meters and never trigger the fuse built for a supertanker. That precision is the entire point. It lets Iran claim the strait is blockaded while allowing selective traffic through, a pressure valve Tehran can open or close without firing a shot. For 4 months, that selective blockade functioned as a pressure mechanism. A quarter of global seaborne oil trade used to move through these waters before February's blockades began, and every idle tanker at anchor cost someone money by the hour. But influence built on geography assumes the geography can't be routed around. However, it could not be fully routed around, and the blockade was instead lifted on June 17th under a diplomatic agreement. Oman and the International Maritime Organization opened what amounts to a coastal bypass, a corridor hugging the Omani shoreline that avoids the dangerous channels entirely. Call it a detour around a blocked highway, except the detour runs through water the IRGC does not patrol with the same density. On June 25th, the tanker Stoic Warrior leads a column of vessels along that route, and by the end of that single day, 70 merchant ships transited the Strait of Hormuz. This initial wave of vessels proved that a volume that would have taken weeks under the old choke point conditions could move in 24 hours. That rapid clearance lands like a verdict. The blockade that Washington built its post-truce strategic advantage on no longer holds the entire board. Which is why the timing of Pezeshkian's calm proclamation looks less like confidence and more like urgency. If shipping keeps moving around Iran instead of through Iranian-controlled lanes, that frozen capital stops being a bonus and becomes something closer to a necessity. But the Omani corridor is not without its own friction. The International Maritime Organization pauses its evacuation plan in late June after fresh, localized explosive threats surface near the new shipping channels, along with reported skirmishes close to the transit lanes. So the picture is not a clean bypass solved and finished. It is a fragile workaround, contested in real time, where every day of continued transit depends on sweeping operations keeping pace with a hazard field that can still shift. Consider the engineering problem facing anyone tasked with clearing this water. These magnetic acoustic triggers do not announce themselves. Sweeper vessels work in a narrow band between two failure modes: move too fast and miss a submerged threat sitting at the edge of sonar resolution, move too slow and leave the corridor closed long enough to strand another large wave of shipping. The presence of hidden obstructions across a strait this size is not a physical wall. It is a probability field, and every vessel that transits safely simply means the odds held that day, not that the field is empty. That is the strategic bind Iran now sits inside. A blockade built on selective, hard-to-detect subsurface devices gave Tehran deniability and control simultaneously, since no single incident could be traced back cleanly to a state decision. But deniability cuts both ways. Because Iran cannot openly admit the ordinance is a controlled instrument without inviting direct retaliation under the truce terms, and it cannot openly clear them without losing the diplomatic tool entirely. So the underwater hazard field sits there, half threat and half liability, while the diplomatic clock keeps running. Look at what the Qatari statement actually reveals about the region's financial architecture. Doha did not simply refuse a request. It drew a boundary around what an escrow custodian can and cannot do publicly in front of international press, which sets a precedent for every future frozen asset negotiation in the Gulf. Any state expecting to unlock restricted funds through political proclamation alone now has a clear counterexample. The money moves when the contract terms are met, not when a domestic audience needs to hear a victory speech. This also reframes Qatar's position in the broader truce. Doha is hosting American envoys, holding Iranian funds, and publicly declining to bend the rules for either side. That is not neutrality by accident. It is a calculated position that lets Qatar remain the essential intermediary for both Washington and Tehran, precisely because it refuses to be used as a pressure point by either government. Inside Tehran, this public contradiction triggers immediate bureaucratic damage control. Within hours of the Qatari briefing, state-run news outlets quietly edit their online dispatches, changing direct assertions of an active wire transfer to vague statements about ongoing technical audits in Doha. In Parliament, senior members of the National Security Committee call for closed-door sessions to shift blame, suggesting Western interference halted an otherwise completed banking agreement. This rapid rewriting of the narrative reveals how quickly the administrative apparatus must pivot when a high-profile domestic claim is flatly denied by its foreign counterpart. And underneath all of it, the 60-day negotiation period does not pause for any of this. Every week spent on an escrow dispute is a week not spent negotiating the nuclear and security terms the Islamabad Memorandum actually requires before the deadline expires. A distracted negotiating team, split between chasing frozen cash and managing a contested strait, has less bandwidth for the harder conversation still waiting. The Strait of Hormuz is not reopened. Numerous subsurface hazards remain unaccounted for in the main channel. The International Maritime Organization's sailor evacuation plan operates under paused status pending new threat assessments, and no bilateral talks between Washington and Tehran have started, despite two senior American envoys sitting in Doha. What changed on June 30th is narrower and more precise. The gap between what Tehran told its own people and what actually crossed a bank ledger became visible to the entire region in real time from a podium in Doha. This standoff exposes a structural shift in how regional power is projected. For decades, the ability to close physical shipping lanes was the ultimate trump card for Iran seeking to extract concessions from global powers. That equation is changing because the international financial system and regional maritime architecture have become far more resilient to isolated pressure. Modern supply chains struggle to adapt to localized disruptions at key maritime choke points due to a lack of high-capacity alternative corridors, while global banking compliance remains insulated from the political declarations of individual governments. Consequently, the traditional tools of regional escalation are losing their efficacy. When a state attempts to weaponize its geographical position while simultaneously relying on international banks to rescue its economy, it encounters a fundamental contradiction. The rules governing global capital do not bend to naval posturing, and the commercial fleets of the world will always seek the path of least resistance. That gap is now the story every Gulf capital is watching, because the next move, whether it comes from Tehran, Doha, or Washington, will decide whether the 60-day clock ends in a real agreement or in another declaration nobody can verify.